Greetings, Internet friends. This is AJ with 8-Bit Horse with another episode of Oddities in 2D. Today we're going to be taking a look at a plug-and-play arcade stick that's manufactured by Radica, featuring 5 classic arcade games from Taito. Now you'll notice that the game isn't called the Taito arcade stick, but rather the Space Invaders arcade stick, and with good reason. After all, Space Invaders is the game that the company is best known for, and it's the game that got Taito their start in arcade game development. So before we take a look at the stick, let's take a look at the history of how Space Invaders came to be in the first place. Prior to the release of Space Invaders, Taito was primarily known as a manufacturer of jukeboxes and pachinko machines. But on Friday, June 16th, 1978, all of that changed and Taito became one of the world's premier arcade game developers. While Taito is the company behind Space Invaders, the creation of the game can really be attributed to just one man, Tomohiro Nishikado. Inspiration for the game came from Atari's classic arcade hit Breakout, which was released in 1976. But Nishikado wanted to create a game where the blocks could fight back. Now history has shown that that's a pretty good idea for an arcade game, but bringing that idea to fruition was no easy task. Now, today if you wanted to create a video game, you could sit down at your computer and start punching in code. But in 1978, the personal computer was very uncommon, and the hardware that was available was not at all powerful. So in the end, Nishikado had to create not only the graphics, the sound, and the gameplay programming for Space Invaders, he also had to develop the hardware that it would run on. In the end, he ended up using an Intel 8080 processor, but even that was not powerful enough to create a game according to his vision. For instance, due to the hardware limitations, the game couldn't display graphics in color. Space Invaders was the first arcade game to include fully animated characters, but the draw on the processor was very heavy. Nishikado wanted players to face off against a wall of enemies, again similar to the blocks in Breakout, but when he had a screen full of enemies, the processor slowed way down. Since the processor could move enemies more quickly when there were fewer on the screen, Nishikado turned that into a gameplay feature. The more enemies the player destroys, the faster they move, thus making the gameplay more frantic as the player moves through each wave. Unlike other arcade games at the time, Space Invaders allowed for progression through multiple waves of enemies. This kept players coming back for more as they tried to make it into later levels of the game, and they tried to beat the high score at the top of the screen. Adding in protective barriers at the bottom of the screen and destructible enemy projectiles added another layer of strategy to the game, which had a delicate balance of risk and reward as the player moved out from the safety of the barriers to destroy enemies before they got too low and destroyed him. As we all know, Space Invaders was a hit. By this time, arcades were already on the rise in the US, but most of Japan's gaming experiences were relegated to pachinko parlors. Space Invaders changed that almost overnight. Space Invaders machines started popping up all over the place, and some arcades opened up filled wall to wall with nothing but Space Invaders machines. By now we've all heard the stories that Space Invaders was so popular in Japan that it actually caused a shortage of the 100 yen coins needed to play the game. But it was more than just a monetary success. For some gamers, it was an addiction. Kids were skipping school and staying out all night just so they could play Space Invaders, and there were even stories of thefts where the motivation was to get more money to go and play the game. In the end, the government had to step in, and they ended up restricting the operating hours for arcades and set a midnight curfew for children. In 1979, the game made its way to the US in the form of an upright arcade cabinet, courtesy of Bally Midway. Since the graphics were only in black and white, they decided to add a cellophane overlay, with a green section at the bottom, clear in the middle, and red at the top. So that's the reason why we typically think of the player ship and the barriers as green, the invaders as white, and the UFO that moves across the top of the screen as red. It's also the reason why enemy ships and projectiles that move below a certain point on the screen change colors. Later on, those overlays were also added to machines in Japan with an even wider variety of colors. Eventually, processors became powerful enough that they could render the game in color, but they still mimicked the effect of the overlay, with invaders changing colors as they moved down the screen. The stick itself is pretty well designed. It's set up to look a bit like an arcade cabinet with a marquee across the top, and there's the little Space Invaders on the sticker in the background. Has kind of a neat angled feature and curve down there at the bottom as well. From a construction standpoint, it's pretty well made. There's a little bit of play in the buttons, so you have to press them about halfway down before you start feeling resistance, and then you've got the digital click from there on down. You'll notice it's set up for both right and left-handed players, so you've got A and B on either side. Obviously, it's quite a bit larger than a traditional gamepad, so it's not really meant to be picked up and played. Ideally, you would set it down on a flat surface. It's got rubber feet on the bottom to keep it from sliding around, and it's got a pretty good weight to it as well. And obviously, if you have batteries in it, it's going to have a little bit more weight there as well. So ideally, you'd set it on a flat surface and play it that way. Probably the best feature of the stick altogether is the control stick itself, which has micro switches, so you can hear the clicks when you go in each direction, and it actually allows for 8-way directional control. Unfortunately, there's only one game in the collection that actually allows for 8-way control, which would be Colony 7. Most of the other games, you're only moving back and forth to the left and right, so it's not too big of a deal, but it's a nice touch. Oddly, the stick also rotates freely left and right, although no games actually use that feature. The only reason I point it out is because there are a couple of arcade sticks. For instance, Namco's stick that has pole position on it actually allows you to turn the stick to steer. So it is used in some games, but it's not used in this case. There's a menu button up in the top corner as well, so at any time, if you want to go back to the main menu, you can whack that button. Although you'll actually end up back at the main menu anyway when you lose all of your lives in one of the games, which is a little bit silly. I'll show you that when we get to the gameplay footage. And there's a red light at the top that indicates that you've got power. Along the side is the on-off switch. The game does run on 4 AA batteries. However, there's also a DC adapter port on the back. So that's not included with the game, but if you buy an AC adapter, you can plug it in and run off that, or you can get a universal adapter that allows for multiple voltages, and you just select the 6-volt setting. You try not to set the other ones, because I'm not sure what happens. I think it explodes, maybe, if you pick the wrong setting, so don't do that. It has a pretty long cord to it as well. As you might expect, there's just a composite output, so you've got an audio and a video, so sadly, those of you who have upgraded from a mono television, that I would assume would be most of you, are only going to get sound out of one speaker. And I'll apologize in advance because the recordings of the gameplay footage have audio coming from only one side, so you'll get to suffer through that. As we take a quick look at the packaging, we see the Space Invaders logo that's included on the stick, as well as the note that there's 5 Taito games in one, and we see that it plugs directly into your TV, and there's a list of the games that are included. On the back of the box, we have screens of the 5 games that are included in the collection, as well as some artwork from the original Space Invaders arcade cabinet. The text on the back of the box also makes some bold and sometimes technically inaccurate statements. The back of the box says, "Here come the aliens," in the first rendition of the most popular arcade games of all times, Space Invaders. So it's so popular, it's popular in multiple timelines, apparently. Arcade Legends Space Invaders, which is the official name of this stick, replicates in detail the popular classics' game codes and graphics. So get your fingers ready, grad the controls, that's G-R-A-D, good job guys, and start launching missiles at those pesky little critters. Arcade Legends Space Invaders is designed for both left and right-handed players with a unique 2-handed joystick. Technically it's a 1-handed joystick with buttons on either side, but hey. Includes 5 of the classics such as Phoenix, Lunar Rescue, Quicks, and Colony 7. So now I suppose we should probably take a look at some of the gameplay. There's not too much to the interface on the stick itself. When you turn it on, you'll see the Radica logo, followed by the Taito logo, and then a list of the games that are included in the collection. You cycle through them with the stick and pick the one you want to play. When you fire up the Space Invaders game, you'll be taken to an attract mode screen, similar to the one in the arcade, showing you the point values for each of the enemies as they're shot down. When you start the game, you'll be placed directly into combat, facing off against 5 rows of invaders as they move back and forth across the top of the screen, dropping bombs, and they drop by 1 line each time they reach the edge of the screen. So just like in the arcade original, your goal is to shoot them all before they kill you. Each time you take a hit, or each time the row of enemies reaches the bottom line, you will lose a life. As you shoot down more and more invaders, the entire formation will begin speeding up, making them harder to hit, until you get down to just that one last invader who's rocketing back and forth across the screen, and you have to take him down before he gets to the bottom.
With each successive wave, the enemies will start closer to the bottom of the screen, giving you less time to take them all down before they reach the bottom. If you manage to make it through 10 levels, the formation will reset and go back up to the original placement from level 1. Of course, it should be noted here that it is not possible to continue a game if you lose all of your lives. In any of the games included in this collection, if you lose every life, you will go back to the title screen and have to select the game again from the start. So there's no way to insert a credit and continue. You'll have to get as far as you can in just one shot. Those of you intimately familiar with the original arcade cabinet will notice that the presentation here is a bit stretched out. Since the arcade cabinet had a vertical orientation, it's not uncommon for home versions of Space Invaders to stretch the gameplay to fit the entire screen. Usually the game sticks somewhat close to the original aspect ratio by placing black bars on the sides of the screen and/or putting the high score table and other relevant information on the side instead of on the top and bottom of the screen. But in this case, it wasn't just a matter of taking the arcade original and stretching it out to fit the screen. Here, the game codes actually changed to make the game fill up the entire screen, and the result is that the invaders are actually a little bit further apart than they were in the arcade original, and therefore harder to shoot down. So, for people who are hardcore arcade fans from the original Space Invaders, you're not going to quite get the authentic experience here. This is more built around a casual experience for someone who wants to shoot down the invaders. They follow the basic rules, but it's not an exact duplication of what you're going to find in an arcade. Hardcore Invaders fans will also notice that the emulation for the color overlays is not done the same way either, so bullets don't change color as they get to different points on the screen, as they did in the arcade original and as they do in some of the other emulated versions of the game. The audio in the Radica version of the game is a little bit off as well, but that's to be expected. Most of the older arcade games used hardware-generated sounds, so that's not easy to emulate, and some of the sounds were created from analog means, so as long as the audio isn't terribly grating or way off from what the original game is, it's hard to complain too much about it since that's a really common occurrence in home ports. Let's move on to the second game in the collection, which is Lunar Rescue. Lunar Rescue was released by Taito in 1979, and the design owes quite a lot to the Lunar Lander games, which were popular at the time. But Lunar Rescue does have some unique gameplay all its own to set it apart. First off, the player must descend from a mothership down through a field of floating asteroids to land on a platform and pick up a stranded astronaut. At that time, the asteroids turn into spaceships that fire on the player, and the player has to ascend back up through them, dodging their shots and dodging the occasional meteor that's crashing through the screen. So here is the legend, as explained by the instruction sheet that comes with the arcade stick. Launched by Taito in 1979, Lunar Rescue was the follow-up game to Space Invaders. Unfortunately, it was released at the same time as Asteroids, which pretty much eclipsed most games until the 1980s. This is one of those sleeper games that didn't get a big following since Asteroids was also out. Good luck in rescuing the astronauts. Very informative. An interesting note about the design of this game is that on the way down to the planet, you can engage your thrusters to slow your ship down and to dodge asteroids, and you use up fuel during this time. Once you touch down and rescue an astronaut, you can use your thrusters as much as you'd like, and you can fire at ships, and it doesn't use up any fuel at all. So it's sort of like a strategy game on the way down and an arcade game on the way back up. Gameplay is pretty similar between the arcade version and the home version, although the arcade version does seem to run a little bit more quickly. So we'll show you some footage of both games in action as we let you know what the instructions have to say about this exciting game. Your mission is to save the astronauts stranded on the surface of a rocky planet. You must drop your landing pod from your mothership, guide your ship to the rocky planet's surface, avoiding the asteroids, and land on one of the platforms. One of the stranded astronauts then runs up to your ship, and you must then return him to the mothership. So these are all male astronauts, and they all patiently wait their turn to be rescued, which is nice. On your return trip, there are no asteroids. They have all been transformed into alien ships. Luckily, your ship is armed with a laser and you can destroy the alien ships, rescue all of your astronauts, and you advance to the next harder level. The platforms you have to land on the planet's surface are 3 different sizes with their point values marked on them. Once you rescue an astronaut from a top platform, it disappears and you have to land on the next smaller platform to rescue your man. Rescue your man. On your way down, you have a limited fuel supply that you can use to fire your thrusters to slow your descent. You must land on the platforms or you crash onto the rocks. On your way up, you can increase your speed by using your thrusters. On your ascent, you do not use fuel by firing your thrusters. When you get close to your mothership, the docking bay doors open and you must fly inside. What's interesting about docking with the mothership is that you have to be very careful to get in the door. So it moves back and forth across the top of the screen. When you get close, it stops, and the doors open, and you can fly inside. But if you hit the side, you will drop your astronaut, and he will plummet to his death, and he can't be picked up again. So you, of course, have to be careful to avoid wrecking your ship any way as you go, but you know, it's particularly nasty when you drop an astronaut and get to watch him fall all the way to the bottom of the screen. It makes you sad, and therefore you try harder to not screw up so badly next time. Next up, we have Colony 7, a game for which there is very little to be said. Even the instruction sheet has a hard time finding some interesting things to say about the game, but they do say this. Colony 7, launched in 1981, only existed as an arcade game. Does Colony 7 look a little familiar? If so, think of another game from roughly the same era. Taito's immensely otaku Colony 7 was the inspiration for the iMagic Atlantis Atari 2600 cartridge. While not a licensed home version of Colony 7, iMagic's Atlantis was manufactured for the Atari 2600, Intellivision, and even the Odyssey 2, and was the closest thing one could find to Colony 7 at home. So the best thing that they can say about the game is that somebody else ripped off the design, and you might have played a similar game before that's not at all owned by Taito. So there you go. This is the one game in the collection that allows you to use the 8-way directional controls, and it's set up a little bit like Missile Command, where you're firing at things that are moving in on your home base and will destroy you a bit at a time. Of course, these are ships instead of falling missiles, so they tend to fly around a bit, and each ship has its own abilities, so some ships you can just blow up, other ones will automatically target your turrets, and of course if you lose both of your turrets, you are defenseless and you just get to sit and watch as things blow up. So you move your cursor around and try to blow up the enemy ships before they take out your turrets, or before they blow through the barrier at the bottom of the screen and start taking out your city. Of note is that one of the things you're trying to protect is your special attacks. Down in the city is a series of 3 big blue tanks, and each of those represents one shot from your special attack. Your special attack is basically just a bigger version of your regular attack and takes out more enemies in a wider radius, but you want to make sure that your tanks don't get blown up. You get 3 of those at the start of the game, and you can use them at will throughout. Also of note is the original arcade version actually had 2 different types of special attack. So the arcade machine had 3 buttons, one for regular fire, one for the attack we just mentioned, and another one that was a screen-clearing bomb. So the little missile that's in the lower left-hand corner of the screen, in the arcade version, that's actually your screen-clearing missile. At any point, you can hit that, and it will clear all enemies from the screen. That particular item is missing from this game since the arcade stick only has 2 buttons. Gameplay between the home version and the arcade version is very similar, and the gameplay itself is pretty simple, so there's not much to it other than you move a cursor around the screen and fire at things before they can kill you. The instruction manual describes the gameplay as such. You're in charge of defenses at Colony 7. Even though a shield protects the settlement's power generators, weapons, and populated buildings, the onslaught of alien intruders gradually and inevitably wears that shield down. Once holes have been bored through the shield, the aliens have a clear shot at Colony 7. Defend Colony 7 from alien attack by using 2 ion cannons that fire an exploding shot, knocking out targets near its destination zone, and an Eradicator rocket that acts as a smart bomb, which clears the entire screen. And that's actually not how it works in this game. That's how it works in the arcade version. In this one, you actually have to aim it, and it clears out a wide area, but not the entire screen, so way to go instructions for providing great information. You start with 2 lives and lose 1 if all of the colony is destroyed or if both of your cannons are blown up. Next up, we have the classic arcade game Quicks. And yes, I'm well aware that the actual pronunciation for this game is Kicks. But Kicks is a very non-descriptive term, so you tell people you're having fun playing Kicks and they probably think you're playing with your breakfast cereal or your shoes or I don't know, soccer, I'm not really sure what, but we're going to call it Quicks because that sounds like a game. Too bad. The instruction sheet has this to say about the legend of Quicks. One of Taito's best-known games, Quicks is the hit arcade title that sparked numerous clones. Like all other great arcade classics, the gameplay is simple but highly original and addictive. Quicks is a must-have for every arcade fan and a relaxing break from more serious action fare. Although I'm not sure exactly how relaxing it is, because that freaking Quicks will get on your damn nerves, I can tell you that. It's unpredictable, it moves quickly, you get partway out there and you think you're about ready to seal in like the huge section of the level, and out of nowhere it whacks you and you die. And in the arcade, you put in another quarter and continue. I know I spent a lot of money playing this game in the arcade. It's fun, but it isn't simple. Here's the game according to the instructions. Your goal is use a marker to separate the screen into different portions, thereby claiming the space. In the meantime, you must avoid electronic creatures called quicks, sparks, and others that randomly appear to destroy your marker. The Quicks is an evil and terrifying computer virus. Nobody knows where it comes from. Your mission? Immunize the system against this insidious infection. But the Quicks learns from its mistakes. It also breeds lethal sub-viruses that can quickly spread and infect your system. Each player starts with 3 lives. Fill in sections of computer memory without becoming infected. A level is completed when the required section of memory is immunized against the Quicks. For example, you must immunize 75% of level 1 to advance to level 2. A life is lost if Quicks touches an incomplete line or if the marker is attacked by a fuse or sparks. When it comes down to it, Quicks is a game about greed. Sure, there's some little enemies that travel along the lines and try to push you out of your safe zone, but the most dangerous thing in the game is the Quicks itself, which can't harm you at all as long as you stay on the line. Where you run into trouble is when you're trying to box the Quicks in. Ideally, you want to close in as much space as possible, but the bigger the space, the more likely the Quicks is to touch the line while you're creating it, thus killing you. Also, you get double the points for drawing a slower line, so that's the temptation for players to go out and go for a big score and potentially die spectacularly. One of the more effective high-scoring strategies is to build a series of little peninsulas out into the middle of the screen, and then draw the last tiny connector with a slow line blocking out half the screen all at once for double the points for that area. Of course, the Quicks itself is very unpredictable, and you still run the risk of the thing changing direction on a dime and killing you in seconds flat. Gameplay between the version on the stick and the version in the arcade is very similar, but the Quick seems to be a bit more aggressive and a little bit quicker in the arcade version. And finally we have Phoenix, a game that wasn't developed by Taito, but rather Amstar Electronics, based in Phoenix, Arizona. The game came out in 1980, so to get a quick history lesson, Space Invaders was released in 1978 and was a huge success. So naturally, other arcade game developers wanted to cash in on that success and develop similar games of their own. So at this point, Namco's Galaxian was already on the market, and rather than featuring rows of invaders that steadily moved down the screen, it featured rows of insects, some of which could break off from the formation and come down and attack the player on their own. In the third and fourth phases, you face a couple of different egg formations as they move back and forth along the top part of the screen. You try to hit them in their egg forms, which are pretty small targets, but after a while they will hatch and open up and display themselves as giant birds. At that point, you can hit them in the body to destroy them, or hit them in the wings, which will clip the wing and make them a smaller target yet again. Another unique feature about this game, particularly for the time that it was released, is that every 5 levels you'll face off against a huge UFO boss. The UFO has a shield underneath it, so you can shoot your way up through those shields to hit a rotating barrier. Every time you hit the rotating barrier, a little bit of it cracks open, and eventually you can open up gaps. What you want to do is get a gap directly underneath the alien pilot and shoot a bullet up through to kill him. It only takes 1 hit to take out the pilot, but that's no easy task. While you're fighting the UFO, Phoenixes will be descending upon your position, shooting you and basically just making it difficult to maneuver, and anytime you're directly underneath the alien, he'll drop bullets on you. So, You can get off to the side, open up a gap, and then get directly underneath the alien, shoot up through, and go for the kill shot. You do have a limited use shield as well, which you can use especially when you're directly underneath the alien, and you can continue to shoot while it's engaged, so it will take out any enemies that fly up against you, and it will block any enemy shots.
So that was a look at the Space Invaders arcade stick from Radica. Now, as mentioned, the stick is really geared more towards the casual consumer. If you're a hardcore Space Invaders fan, or a fan of any of the games in the collection, chances are you're going to be a little bit disappointed that they're not more faithful to the arcade originals. If you're looking for a more faithful arcade port, you're better off with something like the Taito Legends game. The first disc in the series has Space Invaders, Phoenix, and Colony 7, as well as a number of other good Taito games, including Elevator Action and Bubble Bobble. There's also a lot of extra footage on here with developer interviews and some neat history for the different games, so that's a good one to pick up. The series went on with Taito Legends 2. Now, when they put this game out, somewhere along the line, somebody decided all those neat little extras that were in the original, the video footage, they figured nobody needed that anymore, probably, because you're just going to use the internet to find that out. So they stripped all that down, but there's still a number of really good titles on here. Lunar Rescue and Quicks are both on here, as well as a lot of the different Space Invaders games that came later. So there are Space Invaders DX, Space Invaders 91, Space Invaders 95, which is a really neat sort of parody of the Space Invaders game. So that's pretty interesting to check out on its own. So Taito went on to make a lot of new releases, a lot of iterations on their popular titles, Space Invaders being the most obvious one, but they did it with Quicks as well. So this is an example here. This is Quicks Neo on the PlayStation 1, which was released as a budget title. It's essentially, the core gameplay is just the Quicks formula with a few little tweaks here and there, but otherwise you're basically playing Quicks with some neat backgrounds. So that's something interesting to check out. But the series that went on to have the most new releases was definitely Space Invaders. In 1978, Space Invaders was absolutely revolutionary, and Taito wasn't ready to give that up. So Taito kept pushing out Space Invaders games, and still does to this day. There are Space Invaders games being released on new consoles, and not just ports of the original games. There's Space Invaders Infinity Gene, there's the interesting Space Invaders Extreme series on the Nintendo DS, which in Japan actually had a neat little paddle that you could plug into the Game Boy Advance port to control your ship. That unfortunately wasn't released in the US, but it's a good series nonetheless. And there's even some really oddball titles like the Space Raiders game on the GameCube. This one is very odd. You're basically controlling a human being as he runs back and forth on the bottom of the screen, and you're shooting aliens in an alley. So you shoot them and they burst into guts and everything like that. Very, very odd title. You can play single player or two-player co-op, but this is definitely one of the more interesting and odd and sort of mediocre experiences in the Space Invaders series, but it's worth checking out anyway, just for the novelty. Another neat thing about the popularity of the Space Invaders series is you get neat little novelty items like mini arcade games, and this is actually a newer version. They used to release a lot of these little games back in the day for Pac-Man and other really popular titles. But this actually is much newer than that. But you see it's got the Space Invaders design and everything, and it's got a version of Space Invaders all its own built in. But we'll come back to this one later. This is worth checking out all by itself. So that's all we have for you in this episode, but we have a whole lot more oddities lined up in the future. So keep tuning in back here, and we will continue to scour space and time to bring you more oddities in 2D.